It was a humid morning in the Pacific, and the sun had barely pierced the horizon when the first whispers of chaos began. On a small, battered outpost, surrounded by dense jungle and jagged cliffs, the tension was palpable. The air carried the smell of salt, sweat, and gunpowder, and every sound and insect chirping, a distant explosion felt magnified, almost menacing. Here, in this unforgiving terrain, the stakes were higher than most could imagine. A single mistake could cost hundreds of lives. And yet, amid the fear and uncertainty, one man's ingenuity was about to change everything. He wasn't a general or a decorated war hero from a Hollywood story. He was a Marine, an ordinary man with extraordinary courage and a mind sharpened by experience. A black Marine, young, determined, and fiercely committed to the brothers and sisters fighting alongside him. His reputation wasn't built on medals or accolades. No, it was built quietly, in the trenches, in the sweat of preparation, in the unseen calculations made under pressure. And what he was about to do, what seemed impossible to everyone else, would etch his name into the memories of thousands who would owe their lives to a single, audacious shot. It all started with a simple wire. Just a thin, unassuming piece of metal, cheap, unremarkable, what some would call a 50-cent wire. Most of the men passing by probably wouldn't have given it a second thought. But in the hands of someone who understood not just weapons, but the subtle dance between physics, timing, and human instinct, that wire became a tool of survival, a weapon of precision that would alter the course of a battle. To understand why this shot mattered, you need to know the background of the fight. The battle wasn't taking place in an open field or a wide valley where strategies could unfold with some margin for error. No, this was a labyrinth of jagged terrain, cliffs dropping into unseen ravines and dense foliage, concealing enemy positions at every turn. Communication lines were limited, supply chains were thin, and reinforcements could take hours or worse to arrive. Every decision carried the weight of life or death. The Marines in this sector were outnumbered, and they knew it. Intelligence reports suggested the enemy was advancing with precision, almost methodically, targeting strategic points that could cripple defenses. The landscape worked against them. Open lines of fire were scarce. Any engagement without careful planning risked devastating losses. And then came the information that would set the stage for one man's daring plan. The enemy was preparing to strike a critical supply line, one that supported thousands of troops, waiting just beyond the jungle's edge. If that supply line fell, the consequences would be catastrophic. Lives would be lost, equipment destroyed, and morale shattered. It was in this moment that our Marine's mind went to work. He knew the traditional ferry. Her approaches wouldn't succeed. Artillery was too far away, too slow, too unpredictable in such terrain. Direct engagement would expose too many men to fire. He needed a solution that was unconventional, precise, and immediate. And the answer, as odd as it may sound, came down to that unassuming wire. For weeks, he had been experimenting with rigging and mechanical adjustments, testing distances, angles, and tension. Every detail mattered. One miscalculation could send the projectile wide, or worse, turn the weapon on his own men. Yet he persisted, meticulously documenting variables, trusting his instincts, and relying on lessons learned from months of grueling, unforgiving combat. By the time the moment arrived, he had memorized every factor: the wind, the angle, the pull of the trigger, the position of the enemy. He had practiced mentally over and over, visualizing the shot as if he were tracing the path of the projectile with his own eyes. There was no room for error. There was only preparation, focus, and the quiet confidence of a man who knew he could make the impossible happen. And as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the jungle with harsh, unforgiving light, the Marine stepped into position. Around him, the tension of the men watching was nearly unbearable. No one spoke. Every eye followed him. Every breath seemed to pause. The fate of hundreds, maybe thousands, rested on what he was about to do. He attached the wire, adjusted it with the precision of a watchmaker, and prepared himself to execute a shot that many would later call impossible. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but there was a calm, almost eerie clarity in his movements. Time seemed to stretch as he measured, calculated, and waited for the perfect moment. And then, with a quiet click that would echo in the memories of those who witnessed it, The shot was ready. In that instant, the battlefield held its breath. The jungle, the cliffs, the unseen enemy, it all seemed to pause in anticipation of one thin wire, one single shot, and one man's unwavering courage. And that, as the men would soon discover, was the moment that would save 2,000 lives. The morning air still hung heavy with heat and anticipation when the Marine readied his weapon. Every motion was deliberate, every breath measured. Around him, his brothers-in-arms crouched low, hearts pounding in their chests, eyes fixed on the man who had quietly become the pivot point of their survival. They trusted him, though few could have imagined the audacity of what he was about to attempt. An 800-meter shot. 800 meters over jagged terrain, past trees and cliffs, into a narrow corridor where enemy forces were advancing, unaware that their fate was about to be rewritten by a single wire and a single Marine. He checked the wire again, simple, inexpensive, almost laughable in its appearance. A 50-cent wire, the men had joked, but in the hands of someone who knew the exact force, the perfect tension, and the precise alignment, that humble tool became a bridge between desperation and salvation. He had rigged it as a guide, a subtle mechanical aid to correct the small imperfections that even the best sharpshooters couldn't account for in a shot of such distance. It wasn't magic, it wasn't luck, it was preparation, ingenuity, and nerves of steel. As he took aim, the jungle seemed to grow quiet. Birds stopped singing. Insects held their ceaseless chatter. Even the distant thrum of artillery seemed to fade, leaving only the tense rhythm of human breath and the rustle of leaves. He focused on the target, a small clearing where the enemy had set up a heavy machine gun nest, the kind of position that could tear through a line of advancing Marines in moments. If left unchecked, it would decimate their forces, cut supply lines, and send shockwaves of chaos through the ranks. The Marine visualized the path. 800 meters is no small distance. At that length, even the slightest miscalculation, a shift in wind, a minor change in elevation, a moment's distraction could send the shot wide. But he had accounted for it all. Every factor had been considered. He had practiced it mentally countless times. And now, with everything aligned, he let the wire guide him. He squeezed the trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen. Then, in a near-perfect arc, the projectile sailed over the jungle canopy, tracing a trajectory that seemed almost impossible to follow with the naked eye. The men around him held their breath, eyes widening as the bullet or shell, depending on how you measure it, hurtled toward its target. Time slowed, seconds stretching into eternity. The enemy soldiers, engrossed in their own preparations, were oblivious to the invisible thread of fate closing in on them. Then it struck. Precise. Devastating. The machine gun nest erupted in a burst of smoke and debris, the enemy momentarily stunned, forced into chaos. One single shot, guided by ingenuity, had neutralized the threat that could have annihilated their line. The Marines on the outpost barely dared to breathe, watching the aftermath unfold. They had known it was risky, but nothing could prepare them for the perfection of that strike. And the impact wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Morale surged. The men, many of whom had been bracing for disaster, suddenly found hope in the unlikeliest of ways, a clever trick, a bit of wire, and the quiet brilliance of one Marine who refused to let fear dictate the outcome. The enemy scrambled to regroup, disoriented, giving the defenders precious time to reposition, fortify, and push back. In that one act, 2,000 lives that had been teetering on the brink now had a chance. What made this feat even more remarkable was that it wasn't about heroics in the traditional sense. There were no dramatic charges, no last-second dives, no cinematic explosions filling the sky. It was precision, calm, and intellect under pressure, a testament to the Marine's understanding of both his environment and his tools. Soldiers often speak of the touch, a feeling of control over chaos, and he had it in spades. Historians and fellow Marines would later marvel at the simplicity of the setup. The wire wasn't expensive. It wasn't a military secret. It was ingenuity. It was the understanding that in war, sometimes the simplest solutions, executed flawlessly, make the difference between survival and catastrophe. And yet, at that moment, none of that mattered to him. He did what had to be done. He aimed. He calculated, he acted, and he saved lives that had no idea they were in the hands of a man with a wire and nerves of steel. In the following days, the story began to circulate quietly among the troops. Whispers of the 50-cent wire trick traveled from platoon to platoon, growing into legend. It wasn't a tale of glory or medals. It was a story of intelligence and courage. The Marine didn't boast. He returned to his post, ready for whatever came next, but the impact of his actions resonated far beyond that clearing in the jungle. And it wasn't just the shot itself that fascinated people, it was the context. 800 meters in dense jungle terrain, under pressure, with lives on the line, the kind of challenge that would make seasoned snipers hesitate, yet he executed it without hesitation. And in doing so, he illustrated a truth that often gets lost in tales of war. Sometimes, the most extraordinary acts are not the ones we see in movies, but the quiet, precise decisions that prevent disaster before it starts. The Marines who witnessed it carried the story with them, a quiet reminder that heroism isn't always loud. That ingenuity, calm under pressure, and a willingness to think differently can outweigh brute force. And that on the battlefield, even the simplest tools like a thin wire, a steady hand, and a clear mind can change history. By the time the enemy regrouped and pressed forward again, they faced a force reinvigorated, confident, and alive. 2,000 men were now safe because one Marine had refused to accept the impossible. And history, in its quiet way, would remember the shot, the wire, and the courage behind it. The sun had climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the jagged terrain, but the battle was far from over. The enemy, stunned but not defeated, began to regroup, their movements cautious now, uncertain after the precision strike that had decimated their position. The Marines on the outpost remained vigilant, aware that this temporary advantage could vanish in an instant. But beneath the tension, there was a new energy, one of quiet confidence, the kind that only comes from witnessing the impossible come to life. The Marine who had orchestrated the 50-cent wire shot didn't relax. He remained crouched behind cover, scanning the jungle with an intensity that betrayed the weight of responsibility still resting on his shoulders. His mind was already calculating, already anticipating the next moves. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement could be a threat or a signal. And yet, in those tense moments, he allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible smile. He had done what others thought impossible. He had shifted the balance of the battlefield with a single, precise action. Word of the shot had spread through the ranks like wildfire, whispers of awe and disbelief weaving through the men. They spoke not only of the marksmanship, but of the ingenuity, the courage to defy conventional methods when the stakes were highest. 2,000 lives, lives that had teetered on the edge of disaster, had been spared. And though the battle continued, the Marines' action had bought them something invaluable: time. Time to regroup, time to fortify, and time to survive. The enemy pressed cautiously forward, but every step was measured, every advance shadowed by the memory of that precise strike. The outpost, once on the brink of disaster, had become a fortress of determination. The Marines moved with renewed purpose, inspired by the audacity and brilliance of one of their own. They had seen firsthand how ingenuity could surpass brute force, how calm resolve could outperform panic, and how one person, acting decisively, could alter the course of an entire engagement. In the following hours, the Marine didn't seek attention. He didn't stand on a makeshift podium or accept accolades. He returned to his duties, blending back into the ranks, the weight of his accomplishment carried silently. But the impact of his actions reverberated through every unit, every camp, every line of soldiers who would tell the story to the next generation. They called it the 50-cent wire trick, not as a joke, but as a symbol of courage, ingenuity, and the idea that even the smallest tools, in the right hands, could wield extraordinary power. Later, historians and fellow Marines would analyze the feat with admiration. 800 meters, dense jungle, unforgiving terrain. The sheer improbability of the shot became a lesson in creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. Technical manuals would one day cite it as an example of innovative thinking, of battlefield adaptation, of using what you have to achieve what seems impossible. But in the heat of that moment, it was simple. One Marine, one wire, one shot. That was all it took to save thousands. Medals, Statistics and strategies dominate the history books, but it is moments like these that define the experience of those who fight and those who survive. The courage to act, the clarity to see a solution when others see only danger, the patience to prepare for the perfect moment, these are the qualities that echo long after the gunfire stops. And in this case, those qualities manifested in a single, unforgettable act. By nightfall, the outpost was secure. The Marines had weathered the storm, repelled the threat, and held their ground. They knew that lives had been spared, that families far away would receive letters that night instead of mourning. They knew the cost of every second, every decision, every act of ingenuity. And though the 50-cent wire seemed trivial, a simple piece of metal, it had become a symbol of hope, courage, and the extraordinary impact of one individual's determination. Years later, when the Marine story was told around campfires, in training rooms, and in history books, the details would remain vivid. The sweat on his brow, the hush of the jungle, the way the wire guided the impossible shot across 800 meters. But beyond the mechanics, the story endured because of what it represented. That courage is not always loud, that heroism is not always dramatic, and that even in the most desperate moments, one person's brilliance can save thousands. And so, the legacy of that day lives on. In every recounting, in every whisper of admiration, in every lesson taught to new soldiers, the 50-cent wire serves as a reminder that innovation and bravery are inseparable. That, in war, as in life, the smallest tool in the right hands can carry the weight of countless lives. And that courage, when paired with intellect and determination, can transform the impossible into reality. As the jungle settled into the quiet of night, the Marine remained vigilant, but his mind could finally acknowledge what he had achieved. Not glory, not fame, just the knowledge that he had acted, and in doing so, he had ensured that 2,000 men would see another sunrise. The battlefield may have been littered with danger, uncertainty, and fear. But for one moment, ingenuity had triumphed, lives had been saved, and history had quietly remembered a single act of precision and courage. And that is the story of a man, a wire, and a shot that changed everything.